Okay, so building off of my last video on Romans 5:12 to 21 and sort of the universal significance of Jesus there, we're going to move to Romans 9 through 11 to kind of pick up on that. When we move there to that stretch of text, Paul's confidence in the triumph of grace that we saw very clearly in Romans 5:12 to 21 is tested by a painful reality. His own people in their widespread rejection of the Messiah. So these chapters in Romans are some of the most emotionally charged in a certain way in Paul, especially because he's so vulnerable about how he's actually feeling. And at the same time, it's incredibly theologically profound as well. Now, Matt Novenson captures the dynamic of these chapters succinctly. He writes, if Romans 9 is Paul's diagnosis of the present situation, Romans 11 is his remarkably optimistic vision of future resolution. Although presently only an elect few Jews recognize the righteousness of God, in due course all will. It is inconceivable to Paul that they would not do so. This phrase, it is inconceivable to Paul, is important. Paul simply cannot envision a future in which Israel is ultimately lost forever. For him, the God revealed in Christ is too faithful, too determined, too merciful for that kind of outcome. Now, Paula Fredrickson puts it in a slightly different way, describing Paul's eschatological vision as, quote, a divine comedy, a cosmic happy ending, quote. And indeed, this is exactly what Paul is anticipating, the transformation of tragedy into restoration. Yet we shouldn't forget that for Paul, this hope is born out of anguish. He writes in Romans 9:2 that he has great sorrow and unceasing pain in his heart. This is not abstract speculation. It's a deep personal grief over the fact that many of his own kin do not recognize the Lord he has come to love and who encountered him. Even so, Romans 11 leads us toward an astonishing conclusion. All Israel will be saved for Paul. Despite present unbelief, Paul's argument unfolds carefully and deliberately toward that climactic ending. What we need to understand is how Paul believes this conclusion resolves his anguish and sustains his confidence in God's unwavering fidelity. So, let's get into it. Paul begins with the image of the remnant in Romans 11. So I'm starting with 11 and kind of going to go back into 9. It might seem counterintuitive, but you'll see, hopefully it's clear why I do it. You get the remnant imagery of Romans 11, 1 through 7. He poses the question, has God rejected his people? And immediately answers, by no means, meganoito, which he says many, many times. The continued existence of a faithful few within Israel is not a sign of rejection, but of divine faithfulness to the entire group. The remnant functions not as a replacement of Israel as a whole, but as a sign of God's ongoing commitment to that larger people. Okay? It's a living testimony, the remnant is, that God's covenant remains intact. God is faithful to God's promises, even amid partial unbelief among the group. Think of, Isaiah's image of a new shoot growing from the stump of Jesse. The tree may appear dead, but life pulses beneath the surface. So it is with Israel, for Paul. God has not let go of them and will never let go of them. Next, Paul turns to a second image. He writes, if the first fruits are holy, so is the whole batch. Okay. If the first fruits are holy, so is the whole batch. If the root is holy, then so are the branches. So it's from 11:16. The logic here is simple but profound. Holiness at the source consecrates the entirety. Okay. In other words, if the patriarchs and matriarchs, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebecca, Jacob, Leah, Rachel, were made holy, which they were by God's covenant choice, then their descendants remain marked by that same sanctity. The estrangement of the branches cannot nullify the holiness of the root. Then Paul extends the metaphor in his well-known olive tree illustration. Some branches, unbelieving Israelites, have been broken off, and wild Gentile shoots have been grafted in. But these Gentiles must not become arrogant, because God is fully able to graft the natural branches back onto their own tree. Okay. In fact, Paul says that reintegration is more natural, technically, than the inclusion of Gentiles was. The question, of course, is whether these branches are now cut off from salvation because of unbelief. And Paul's answer is pretty hopeful. They are, for now, estranged from the life of the tree, but not forever. The restoration is not hypothetical. It's anticipated, grounded in the character of divine mercy. So faith, or pistis, for Paul, will eventually arise from them. That's the expectation. Not as a human achievement, but as a resonance with the faithfulness of Christ himself. So the branches are broken off because of unbelief, but his expectation is that they'll be, currently unbelieving Israelites will be brought back in, okay? All three of these images, remnant, first fruits, olive tree, find their deepest coherence in a fourth argument that reaches back to Romans 9. Israel will ultimately be saved because her later descendants remained beloved for the sake of the ancestors. God's promises to the patriarchs are unchanging. The holiness of Abraham's covenant, the faith of Sarah, the blessing given to Jacob, all of these constitute the sanctified root from which Israel grows. That root cannot be uprooted, is basically what Paul is getting at. As Paul insists, quote, the gifts and the callings of God are irrevocable in 11:29. Okay? These ancestral promises are not canceled by Israel's current unbelief. They are the very foundation of Israel's ongoing story for Paul. So, summarized so far, Romans 9 through 11, Paul faces that painful reality. Much of Israel does not yet recognize Christ. Okay? Nevertheless, he insists that God's electing purposes for them remain intact and will ultimately be fulfilled. The remnant is not a replacement. It's a guarantee. The first fruits in the root sanctify the entire people. The broken branches will eventually be grafted back in through fidelity. And all of this is underwritten by God's irrevocable commitment and his covenant promises to those ancestors. The sequence culminates then in the affirmation of 11:26, which is all Israel will be saved. Okay. Paul goes beyond that. He doesn't stop there. Having established Israel's future restoration, he extends the logic further, which some people miss. If God's mercy can overcome even present unbelief of some of Israel, God's chosen people, then surely the same mercy must also reach beyond Israel to encompass all those who presently are not responding in faith, overcoming any human recalcitrance. Okay. And this is from Romans 11 as well. For just as you were once disobedient to God, but now you have received mercy because of their disobedience, so you too have now been disobedient, in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may receive mercy. For God has consigned all to disobedience, that he may have mercy on all. Notice the symmetry here, the double all. As Gaventa observes, Paul's conclusion here enlarges the field, okay, of mercy, essentially. What began as an argument about Israel and the Gentiles becomes a declaration about everybody in the entire world. Okay. This double all mirrors the same pattern that we saw in Romans 5:12-21 between Adam and Christ, and universal fall and redemption on the one hand, and then grace that must be at least as broad in reach as that sinful condition. Okay. Still, Paul's optimism does not erase his grief. He laments precisely because many of his kin are not yet caught up in the joy of the gospel, and that grieves him. And this grief is instructive, I think. But it's important to note that Paul does not grieve because he fears eternal torment or annihilation for them. He never says anything like that. His sorrow is not rooted in a theology of ultimate exclusion for some. Rather, it springs from his longing that they might experience now the life and joy that comes from knowing Christ. People sometimes ask, as I talked about in reasons why, universalism is difficult for some people to swallow. Some people will ask, well, if everyone is ultimately going to be saved, why believe now? But that question presupposes that the only motive for faith is the avoidance of some kind of punishment. Paul would immediately reject that premise. For him, faith in Christ, responding to Christ in faith, is intrinsically good. The rationale is internal to that relationship. It is participation in divine life. The tragedy of unbelief is not external exclusion, but the present loss of communion and joy that Paul cares about so much and sees in his own life and the lives of his communities. Paul's own life, as you know, illustrates this perfectly. Once fiercely opposed to Christ, he was transformed when Christ confronted him and revealed himself to him. And that encounter became the center of his existence, his missionary work, his thinking about God, his ethical advice, everything. How could he not long for that same encounter for his own people, right? He even says in Romans 9 that he would be willing to be accursed if it meant their salvation. Okay? That is the posture of someone who longs for and ultimately expects their inclusion. Okay? Paul distinguishes between those who are already living by faith by means of fidelity and those who are not. It's very clear in Paul's data. Believers, he says, already participate in the future reality of salvation here and now. They embody the virtues of new creation, love, joy, peace, self-control, etc., and live in the power of the resurrection, having a raised mind of Christ. They taste the life of the age to come before its full unveiling. But Paul also expects that those who are not yet awakened to this life eventually will be. The arc of divine mercy bends toward universal restoration. As he writes in Philippians 2, famous verse, every knee shall bow, every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord. Every tongue gladly confess. Okay, and in Romans 10:9, he defines that very confession as the mark of salvation in people. Okay. So just kind of going through Paul's logic here, we can summarize it 3 steps. God's promises are irrevocable. Therefore, all Israel will be saved. So that's Romans 11:26-29. God's mercy toward unbelieving Israel reveals the logic of grace that extends to all of humanity. Romans 11:32. The universal salvation, this universal salvation comes through Christ alone. It's not some miraculous event that happens outside of Jesus. Through his faithful life, death, and resurrection, which will eventually awaken responsive faith in all. So, yeah, for Paul, all things will eventually be saved through Jesus Christ and drawn finally into loving divine fellowship forever. It may take some time for people to respond and to experience the benefits of salvation, but in the end, his expectation is that they will. So just to conclude, when Paul reaches the end of his long argument, he breaks into song, basically. He says, "Oh, the depth, the riches and wisdom of the knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments, how inscrutable his ways. And for him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever." This hymn of praise isn't like a digression. It's a natural overflow of Paul's vision. Okay, having traced the faithfulness of God from Abraham to Christ, from Israel to the nations, from disobedience to mercy, Paul can only worship. That's his response. Okay, for him, theology ends where it is fulfilled in this doxological kind of moment. The logic of grace culminates in wonder about what God is doing. If God's plan could turn Israel's unbelief into the occasion of mercy, then the same mercy will also ultimately embrace all of creation. And that, I believe, is Paul's final word. Not exclusion, not despair, but the triumph of divine faithfulness. Christ, the salvation of Israel, and more is what we're talking about here. All right, and with that, this has been Apocalypse Here, Christianity You Can Live With.